Hey Reddit. I don't even know where to start. My name's Scott, and if you'd told me 5 years ago that my life would turn into some soap opera nightmare, I'd have laughed in your face. But here I am, sharing the mess I never thought I'd live through. I've always been the kind of guy who believed in hard work. I grew up in a little town with more cows than people. My dad was a construction worker, and my mom ran a tiny bakery out of our kitchen. They taught me that if you worked hard and stayed honest, life would take care of you. For a while, I thought they were right. I followed my dad into construction. It wasn't glamorous, but it was good, honest work. I started young, hauling materials, learning the ropes, and saving every dime I could. By the time I hit 30, I was foreman on a decent crew. That's where I met Julie. She was beautiful in that kind of effortless way, with a laugh that could light up a room. I fell hard, and within 2 years we were married. For a while, life was good. Too good, maybe. We had a little house, 2 kids, Emily, who's 6, and Tommy, just turned 4, and what I thought was a solid future. But things started to change after the company I worked for hit hard times. A big project fell through, and suddenly I was out of a job. It wasn't just me. Half the crew got laid off. I felt like I'd failed my family. That's when I got my CDL and started driving trucks. It wasn't a dream job, but it paid the bills, and I could keep food on the table. The hours were brutal, though. Weeks on the road meant missed birthdays and bedtime stories. I could feel the distance growing between Julie and me, but I figured it was just a rough patch. I mean, that's marriage, right? You tough it out. Turns out, Julie had other ideas. A few months ago, I started noticing little things. Her phone was always face down, and she was going out more. She said it was girls' nights, but something felt off. I chalked it up to my own insecurities. I was tired, stretched thin, and not around enough. I blamed myself. Then came the night that blew my whole life apart. I came home early from a run, hoping to surprise her. The kids were with my mom, so I figured we could have a quiet night together. But when I walked in, I found her sitting on the couch with my boss, Mark. The way they scrambled apart told me everything I needed to know. I wish I could say I handled it calmly, but I lost it. I demanded to know what was going on. Julie started crying, telling me it wasn't what it looked like. Mark just stood there, looking like a deer in headlights. When he finally left, Julie broke down and admitted everything. They'd been seeing each other for months. I felt like someone had punched a hole in my chest. This was the woman I'd built my life around. She was supposed to be my partner, my teammate, and she was sleeping with the guy who'd given me a job when I was desperate. It felt like a double betrayal. She tried to spin it like it was my fault, that I was never home, that she felt lonely. I wanted to believe her, because that meant maybe I could fix it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about me being gone. This was about her making a choice to betray me. That night, I packed a bag and drove to my mom's place. I remember sitting in my truck for what felt like hours, just staring at the dashboard, trying to make sense of what my life had become. All I could think about were my kids. How was I going to tell them? What kind of example had I set by staying with someone who clearly didn't respect me? The next few days were a blur. My mom kept the kids busy while I tried to sort out my head. I hadn't told her everything yet, just that Julie and I were having problems. She could tell it was more than that, but she didn't push. That's how my mom is, quiet, steady, always letting me come to her in my own time. I avoided Julie's calls for a few days, but eventually, I had to face her. I didn't want to leave things hanging for Emily and Tommy. Julie suggested we talk after work, so I went back to the house. Sitting at that same kitchen table where we used to plan out grocery lists and birthday parties, I couldn't even look at her. She started by saying she was sorry. She said it over and over, like it was supposed to fix something. It didn't mean anything, Scott, she said, her voice trembling. I was lonely, and Mark was just there, but I never stopped loving you. I could feel my jaw clench. You don't do that to someone you love, Julie, I snapped, my voice harsher than I meant it to be. You don't throw away a family because you're lonely. Do you know how many nights I was out there, sleeping in a truck, missing home, missing you? I never once thought about cheating on you. She didn't say anything for a while, just stared at her hands. Then she looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "I made a mistake, Scott. I know I did. But I want to fix this. For the kids. For us." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that this was just some horrible bump in the road and we could move past it. But there was this other part of me, this voice in my head that wouldn't shut up. It kept saying, if she can lie to you once, what's stopping her from doing it again? "I need time," I said finally. "I can't make any decisions right now." Julie nodded, but I could tell she didn't like the answer. She wanted me to forgive her right there, to sweep everything under the rug. But that wasn't happening. Not this time. I stayed at my mom's for a few more days while I tried to figure out my next move. Every time I looked at Emily and Tommy, my heart broke a little more. How could I explain this to them without shattering their world? I didn't want them to see their mom as the villain, but I also wasn't going to lie to them. Finally, I sat down with Emily. She's a smart kid, too smart sometimes. She knows when something's wrong. I told her that Mommy and Daddy were going through a tough time and that I'd be staying at Grandma's for a little while. She looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes and asked, "Are you coming back, Daddy?" I didn't know what to say. "I don't know, sweetie," I said, my voice cracking. "But I'm always going to be here for you and Tommy. That's a promise." She nodded like she understood, but I could tell she was scared. I hated that. I hated that Julie's choices had put us here. A few days later, Julie called and asked if I could meet her and the kids for dinner at our favorite pizza place. She wanted to show the kids everything was okay. I agreed, even though it felt like pretending. When I got there, Julie was already seated with Emily and Tommy. They looked so happy to see me. It hurt. Julie acted like nothing had happened, chatting about Emily's school project and Tommy's new obsession with dinosaurs. For a moment, I let myself enjoy it, just being with my kids, hearing them laugh. But then, out of nowhere, Julie brought up the idea of counseling. "I think it could really help us, Scott," she said, leaning in like she was desperate. "We owe it to the kids to try." The kids were right there, staring at me like I held all the answers. I wanted to say no, to tell her there was nothing a therapist could fix. But Emily was holding my hand, and I couldn't stand the thought of breaking her heart. "Fine," I said finally. "I'll try. For them." Julie smiled like she'd won something. But deep down, I knew I wasn't doing this for her. I was doing it for my kids, to give them a chance at some kind of normal. What I didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. Counseling started the following week. I wasn't thrilled about it, but Julie had already found someone, a marriage therapist named Dr. Nolan, and booked us an appointment. The idea of spilling my guts to a stranger wasn't exactly appealing, but I'd agreed, so I went. The first session was uncomfortable. Dr. Nolan asked us to explain why we were there, and Julie jumped in before I could say a word. She talked about how the distance in our relationship had made her feel neglected and how she'd made a mistake because of it. She cried, real tears, and played the part of the remorseful wife. I sat there, my arms crossed, biting my tongue. When Dr. Nolan turned to me, I told him the truth. She didn't make a mistake. She made a choice, I said, staring at Julie. And now I have to decide if I can live with that. Julie looked down, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. The second session was worse. Dr. Nolan suggested we talk about trust. Julie said all the right things, how she was willing to be an open book, how she'd cut off all contact with Mark, how she wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. I wanted to believe her, but something in my gut told me not to. So, I did something I'm not proud of. That night, while she was in shower, I went through her phone. I didn't find anything incriminating, but I found something else. Messages she deleted and then forgotten to erase from her cloud backup. They were months old, but they told me everything I needed to know. Mark wasn't the first. The texts were with some guy named Greg, someone she'd met at yoga class. It wasn't as long-term as her thing with Mark, but the messages were just as bad. Flirty, sexual, explicit. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut all over again. I didn't confront her right away. I wanted to, but part of me needed to figure out how to approach it. So, I sat on the information for a couple of days, going through the motions at home, and at work. Julie acted like everything was fine, like the counseling sessions were working. But I couldn't stop replaying those texts in my head. Finally, one night after the kids were asleep, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Who's Greg?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Julie froze, her face turning pale. She tried to deny it at first, but when I told her I'd seen the messages, she broke down. "That was a long time ago," she sobbed. "It didn't mean anything, Scott. I was in a bad place." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A bad place. I shot back. "You've been lying to me for years, Julie. How many other bad places were there?" She didn't answer. She just cried, saying how sorry she was, how much she loved me, how she wanted to make things right. But I was done. I couldn't take it anymore. "I can't do this," I said, standing up. "I tried, Julie. I really did. But I'm not going to keep living like this." I grabbed my keys and walked out, leaving her crying at the kitchen table. I didn't have a plan. I just drove. Ended up at a truck stop diner, drinking bad coffee and staring out the window. My whole life felt like a lie. Everything I thought I knew about Julie, about our marriage, was gone. When I finally got back to my mom's, it was almost dawn. She was up, making coffee, and took one look at me before pulling out a chair. "Want to talk about it?" she asked. I did. I told her everything. About Mark, about Greg, about how I didn't know who Julie was anymore. My mom listened quietly, nodding every so often. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Scott, you've got to figure out what's best for you and those kids," she said gently. "You're a good man, and you deserve someone who sees that. Don't let Julie's choices make you forget who you are." Her words stuck with me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little bit of clarity. I wasn't the one who had broken our family. I wasn't the one who needed to fix things. That was on Julie. The next day, I called a lawyer. The lawyer's office was in a strip mall on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but I didn't care. I just wanted someone who could help me figure out what my options were. Her name was Claire, and she had this no-nonsense vibe that instantly put me at ease. After I told her the basics of what had happened, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "Scott, I won't sugarcoat this. Divorce is messy, especially with kids involved. But if you're ready to move forward, I'll make sure you get a fair deal." Fair. That's all I wanted at this point. I wasn't looking to bleed Julie dry or play dirty. I just wanted a clean break, and to protect Emily and Tommy as much as possible. Claire explained the process, custody arrangements, splitting assets, all of it. She also asked about the affair and if I had proof. When I mentioned the texts with Mark and Greg, she nodded like she'd seen this 100 times before. "Keep copies of everything," she said. "It might not change the outcome, but it'll help if she tries to deny anything." Leaving that office felt like I was stepping into the unknown. Part of me was terrified of the fights, the lawyers, the paperwork. But there was also a weird sense of relief. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I had a plan. When I told Julie I'd filed for divorce, she didn't take it well. She cried, begged, and said all the things I used to want to hear, that she'd do anything to make it right, that we could fix this. But I wasn't buying it anymore. "I gave you a chance," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "You didn't just hurt me, Julie. You broke my trust over and over. I can't come back from that." She switched gears after that, turning angry and defensive. "So that's it," she snapped. "You're just going to walk away and break up our family." "I'm not the one who broke it," I said quietly. And that was the last time I let myself feel guilty about it. The next few weeks were brutal. Julie stayed in the house while I stayed with my mom, and we took turns with the kids. I missed Emily and Tommy like crazy, but I made the most of time I had with them, movie nights, building forts, anything to make them smile. It killed me knowing they didn't fully understand what was happening. Julie started making things difficult. She'd show up late to drop-offs or complain about the schedule, clearly trying to get under my skin. One day, she even told Emily, "Daddy's the one who doesn't want to be a family anymore." I nearly lost it when Emily repeated that to me. But instead of blowing up, I just hugged her tight and said, "No matter what happens, I'm always going to be your dad. That'll never change." I'd thought the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong. One afternoon, I got a call from Claire. "Scott, we need to talk," she said, her tone serious. "Julie's lawyer just filed a motion claiming that you've been verbally abusive and that she should have full custody of the kids." "What?" I stammered. "That's not true. I've never—" "I know," Claire interrupted. "But claims like this can muddy the waters. It's a tactic to put you on the defensive." I was furious. Julie had already wrecked our marriage. Now she was trying to paint me as some kind of monster to keep me away from my kids. I felt the old construction worker temper bubbling up, but I knew better than to let it take over. "We'll fight it," Claire said firmly. "But from now on, document everything. Every conversation, every interaction. If you're picking up the kids, bring a witness or record it if it's legal in your state." I started keeping a notebook in my truck, jotting down dates and details of every interaction with Julie. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad TV drama, but I wasn't taking any chances. The worst part was the toll it took on the kids. Emily started acting out at school, and Tommy had nightmares almost every night. I tried to shield him from the tension as much as I could, but kids aren't stupid. They knew something wasn't right. One night, while Emily was drawing at the kitchen table, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are you and Mommy ever going to stop fighting?" Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I knelt down beside her, brushing her hair out of her face. "I'm so sorry, sweetie," I said. "Mommy and I are trying to figure things out, but I promise you this. I will always be here for you and your brother, no matter what." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I hated Julie all over again for putting us in this position, but I pushed those feelings down, reminding myself that my kids needed me to be steady, not bitter. The next court hearing was a disaster. Julie's lawyer brought up the allegations of verbal abuse, painting a picture of me as a hot-headed truck driver who was never home. Claire countered with character references and the detailed log I'd been keeping. But the whole process left me drained. This wasn't just a fight for my kids. It felt like a fight for my whole identity. When the hearing ended, Julie shot me a look that I'll never forget. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was pure venom. I realized then that the woman I'd loved, the mother of my kids, wasn't coming back. Whoever she'd become, I didn't recognize her anymore. That night, as I sat alone in my truck, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Julie or this divorce define me. I didn't know what the future looked like, but I was done being a victim. It was time to start rebuilding. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy. Most days, it felt like I was just scraping by, trying to hold things together for the kids. But something in me had shifted after that court hearing. I was done letting Julie or anyone else control the narrative. If I was going to move forward, I had to take charge of my story. The first thing I did was throw myself into work. Truck driving had always been a means to an end, not a passion. But one day, during a long haul, I found myself parked at a rest stop next to a guy unloading this intricate wrought iron sculpture from his truck bed. It caught my eye. These twisting vines and leaves, all hand-forged. I struck up a conversation, and it turned out the guy was a blacksmith who made custom pieces for clients all over the state. He told me about how he'd started as a hobbyist, just messing around in his garage, and eventually turned it into a business. Something about the way he talked about it, like it gave him purpose, stuck with me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Back in high school, I'd taken a metal shop class and loved it. I wasn't great at it, but there was something satisfying about turning raw materials into something solid, something permanent. The idea of working with my hands again felt right. A few weeks later, I started doing research. I couldn't afford a full forge setup, but I found some basic tools online and started small, practicing in my mom's garage when I wasn't on the road. My first few pieces were terrible, crooked, uneven, not fit for anything. But I kept at it, learning from YouTube tutorials and books I borrowed from the library. Slowly, I started getting better. One day, Emily wandered into the garage and watched me hammering out a rough blade. "What's that, Daddy?" she asked, her face lighting up with curiosity. "It's a sword," I said, grinning. "Well, it's supposed to be." She giggled and asked if she could help. For the first time, in what felt like forever, we spent the afternoon just having fun. She held the tongs while I hammered, and when we were done, we had something that sort of resembled a tiny, lopsided dagger. I let her keep it, and she showed it off to Tommy like it was a treasure. That day reminded me why I was fighting so hard for them. They didn't care about court battles or custody schedules. They just wanted a dad who was present, who could make them laugh and feel safe. I couldn't change what Julie had done, but I could control how I showed up for my kids. By chance, I stumbled onto a whole community of blacksmiths and metalworkers online. I joined a few forums, posted pictures of my projects, and started getting feedback from people who'd been at it for years. One guy, Mike, invited me to a local Renaissance festival where he sold handmade armor and weapons. "You'll love it," he said. "It's like stepping back in time." I wasn't sure at first, but I figured it'd be a good way to see what other craftsmen were doing. Plus, the kids were into knights and castles, so I thought they'd enjoy it too. The festival turned out to be a turning point. Walking through the gates, seeing the booths lined with swords, shields, and chainmail, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. The craftsmanship was incredible. Every piece told a story. And the people. They weren't just selling stuff. They were living their passion. Emily and Tommy had a blast, running around in their little costumes and fighting with foam swords. I ended up spending most of the day at Mike's booth, asking him a million questions about his work. By the time we left, I knew I wanted to be a part of that world. Back home, I started focusing on making pieces that fit the Renaissance vibe. Daggers, simple decorative swords, even a few rough helmets. My skills weren't quite there yet, but I kept pushing myself. On weekends, I'd set up a little table at the local flea market. I didn't sell much at first, but the people who stopped to talk were encouraging. The more I worked, the more I realized how much I loved it. It wasn't just about the metal. It was about creating something that mattered, something that felt like me. For so long, I'd let my life be shaped by other people, by Julie, by my job, by everything I thought I was supposed to be. But this was mine. One day, I got a call from Mike. "We've got a spot opening up at the festival," he said. "It's short notice, but if you want in, it's yours." I hesitated. The festival was a big step, a real commitment. But then I thought about Emily and Tommy, about showing them that it's never too late to start over. "I'm in," I said. That first festival was chaos. My booth wasn't fancy, just a pop-up tent with a few display tables. But when people started stopping by, asking about my work, I felt this rush I hadn't felt in years. By the end of the weekend, I'd sold half my inventory and gotten orders for custom pieces. More importantly, Emily and Tommy were there, cheering me on. It felt like a win, not just for me, but for us. For the first time since the divorce, I felt like I was building something real, something lasting. The Renaissance Festival changed everything for me. It wasn't just about selling pieces. It was about finding a purpose. Seeing people appreciate my work, watching Emily and Tommy run around the festival, laughing, it felt like I'd finally turned a corner. I started dedicating more time to metalworking, even cutting back on truck driving. Every spare hour went into the garage, crafting better swords, shields, and even bits of armor. Orders trickled in slowly at first, but word spread, and before I knew it, I had steady customers. Meanwhile, Julie wasn't making things easy. She was still bitter about the divorce and tried to stir up trouble, making late-night calls or sending long texts about how I was abandoning her. I stopped engaging. My focus was on the kids and rebuilding a life I could be proud of. One weekend, while working at the festival, a woman came by my booth, a familiar face I couldn't place at first. Her name was Hannah, and I realized she was Mike's younger sister. We started chatting, and she mentioned how her brother had told her about my work. I wasn't looking for anything, but there was something about Hannah. She was warm, funny, and didn't pry into my messy past. Over the next few weeks, she'd stop by to help out or just hang around, and before long, I found myself looking forward to seeing her. It felt complicated, though. Her brother had a history with me, an old misunderstanding that had caused tension years ago. But Hannah didn't seem to care. She wasn't looking at my past. She was seeing the person I was trying to become. I didn't rush it. I wasn't ready for anything serious, and Hannah respected that. We spent time talking, laughing, and slowly getting to know each other. It felt easy. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Life wasn't perfect, but for the first time, it felt like I had a shot at something good, something real. Hannah and I kept things simple at first. She'd swing by my booth at festivals, sometimes bringing snacks or helping me set up. The kids adored her, Emily especially. She had this way of making everyone feel comfortable, like she'd been part of our lives forever. But there was this lingering tension in the back of my mind. Her brother, Mike, and I hadn't exactly been close. Years ago, we'd worked on a construction site together, and there'd been an argument about a safety issue I'd reported. It got heated, and though it was the right call, Mike hadn't forgiven me for making him look bad in front of the crew. We hadn't spoken much since. One evening, Hannah invited me to family dinner. I hesitated, knowing Mike would be there, but she insisted. "He's over it," she said with a laugh. "You're not the same guys you were back then. Besides, you'll be with me." That was enough to convince me. When I walked in with Hannah, the air was thick. Mike gave me a nod, but didn't say much. Most of the evening, I stuck close to Hannah and the kids, who were having a blast playing with her nephews. It wasn't until after dinner, when we were both grabbing drinks in the kitchen, that Mike finally spoke up. "So," he said, leaning against the counter, "you and my sister, huh?" I nodded, trying to gauge his tone. "Yeah, she's amazing." He stared at me for a moment before letting out a low chuckle. "Guess I can't hold a grudge forever. Hannah seems happy. That's what matters." It wasn't a heartfelt apology, but it was enough. We shook hands, and just like that, the tension lifted. With Mike's blessing, things between Hannah and me grew easier. We spent more time together, and she quickly became a constant in my life. She wasn't just good with the kids. She loved them like they were her own. Emily started calling her Miss Hannah, and Tommy followed suit. Seeing them bond with her made me realize just how much she'd come to mean to us. One day, while we were sitting on the porch after dinner, she turned to me and said, "Scott, you don't have to keep looking over your shoulder. You're allowed to be happy." Her words stuck with me. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of the betrayal, the divorce, the constant battle to keep my family together. But Hannah reminded me that life didn't have to be a fight. It could be good. And for the first time, I started to believe her. Things with Hannah settled into something I hadn't felt in years: peace. She wasn't just good for me. She was good for the kids. Emily started drawing pictures of the four of us together, and Tommy wouldn't stop asking when Miss Hannah would visit again. Watching them light up around her made me realize how much of a void Julie had left in their lives. Hannah was filling it in a way I never expected. But life has a way of testing you when you start to feel steady. One afternoon, while I was finishing up a project in the garage, Julie showed up unannounced. She was wearing that determined look she always got when she wanted something. I wiped the sweat from my face and stepped outside. "What do you need, Julie?" She crossed her arms and looked around, avoiding my eyes. "We need to talk," she said. "About the kids." "Okay," I said cautiously, leaning against the workbench. "What's going on?" "I've been thinking," she began, her tone clipped. "Maybe we made a mistake. Splitting up, I mean, for the kids' sake." I stared at her, not sure if I'd heard her right. "Julie, you filed for full custody, lied about me in court, and dragged my name through the mud. Now you want to play happy family again." "It wasn't about you," she snapped. "I was scared, okay? I didn't want to lose them." "Well, you didn't lose them," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you lost me. That's not changing." She paused, biting her lip like she was holding something back. Finally, she sighed. "I see how happy they are when they're with you. I just want to be part of that." I shook my head. "Julie, I'm not keeping the kids from you. You're still their mom. But if you think there's any chance of us getting back together, you're wasting your time." Her face hardened, but she didn't argue. "Fine," she said, turning to leave. "But don't expect me to sit back while someone else plays mom to my kids." After she left, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. I wasn't worried about losing Hannah. The bond she'd built with Emily and Tommy was too strong. But Julie's words still got under my skin. For years, I'd bent over backward to make things work with her, to protect the family we'd built. Now, I realized I didn't have to justify my choices to her anymore. That night, Hannah and I talked about it. She listened quietly as I recounted the conversation, her face calm but thoughtful. When I finished, she smiled softly. "Scott, I'm not here to replace Julie. I'm here because I care about you and the kids. If she's willing to be a better mom, that's a good thing." I knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. Julie wasn't just trying to be a better mom. She was testing the waters, seeing if she could reel me back in. But I was done being caught in her web. The next week, we had a court-mandated co-parenting session. Julie was polite, but distant, clearly still angry about how firmly I'd shut her down. I kept the focus on the kids, refusing to take the bait when she tried to make jabs about Hannah. It wasn't worth it. After the session, as we were walking to the parking lot, she stopped me. "You've changed," she said, almost accusingly. "I had to," I replied. "For myself. For the kids." She didn't say anything else, just got in her car and drove off. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. She was right. I had changed. And for the first time in a long time, I was proud of it, Hannah, and I kept growing closer. But Julie wasn't letting up. She started showing up at more of the kids' events, school plays, soccer games, making subtle digs about how different things felt. I stayed polite, but distant, refusing to engage. One Saturday, after Emily's dance recital, Julie cornered me in the parking lot. "You really think she's going to stick around?" she asked, gesturing toward Hannah, who was buckling Tommy into the car. "Yes, I do," I replied firmly. "Hannah cares about the kids, and me. That's not changing." Julie scoffed. "She doesn't know the real you, Scott." "Not like I do." I wanted to snap, but instead, I took a deep breath. "You're right, Julie. She doesn't know the guy who stayed with someone who didn't respect him. But she knows the person I'm trying to be. That's enough." Julie didn't have a comeback. She just walked away. That night, I told Hannah about the exchange. She smiled and took my hand. "You handled that perfectly. You don't owe her anything, Scott." For the first time, I believed her. Julie's visits grew less frequent after that. I think she realized her attempts to rattle me weren't working anymore. Meanwhile, Hannah became an even bigger part of our lives. She helped Emily with school projects, taught Tommy how to bake cookies, and even encouraged me to take on bigger projects with my metalwork. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I showed Hannah a sword I'd been working on for weeks, a custom order for a collector. "It's incredible," she said, running her fingers over the intricate designs. "You've really found your thing, Scott." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time feeling like I was starting over, but for the first time, it felt like I was building something, not just with my work, but with her. Without overthinking, I said, "Hannah, I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled, leaning in to kiss me softly. "Lucky for you, you don't have to find out." Months passed, and life started feeling steady again. Emily's drawings of our little family now always included Hannah, and Tommy asked her to tuck him in when she stayed over. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Hannah looked at me and said, "Scott, I've been thinking maybe it's time we talk about the future. What we want." I knew what she meant. "I've been thinking about it too. You're already part of our future," I said. "I just want to make it official someday." Her face lit up, and she took my hand. Someday sounds pretty good. After that conversation, someday started feeling closer than I expected. Hannah didn't push, but she didn't have to. She'd become the glue that held our lives together without even trying. The kids adored her. Emily started calling her Mom Hannah in little moments, and Tommy followed suit not long after. I didn't correct them because, honestly, it felt right. But the weight of the past still lingered, especially with Julie. She'd stopped trying to manipulate me directly, but there were still occasional snide remarks or passive-aggressive comments during drop-offs. I tried to rise above it, but one day, she crossed the line. It was during Emily's school play. I was sitting in the front row with Hannah, waiting for the show to start, when Julie arrived. She glanced to Hannah, then walked over and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You're really going to let her play house with my kids?" Hannah tensed, but I placed a hand on her knee to calm her. I turned to Julie and said quietly but firmly, "The kids are happy, Julie. That's what matters. If you can't see that, it's your problem, not ours." Julie's face hardened, but she didn't respond. She walked away, sitting a few rows back. Hannah squeezed my hand, and I could see the gratitude in her eyes. After the play, Emily ran up to us, beaming. "Did you see me, Daddy? Did you see me, Mom Hannah?" she asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Julie overheard and froze. Her expression was a mix of shock and pain, but I didn't let it shake me. I just knelt down, hugged Emily, and said, "You were amazing, sweetheart. We're so proud of you." That night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at me and asked, "Do you think Miss Hannah will stay forever?" Her question caught me off guard. I sat on the edge of her bed and smoothed her hair. "I hope so, Em. I really do." A few weeks later, I decided it was time to make that hope a reality. I started looking at rings in secret, spending late nights scrolling through options on my phone. I wanted something that fit Hannah. Simple, elegant, but meaningful. When the ring finally arrived, I could barely keep the kids from spilling the surprise. Emily was buzzing with excitement, and Tommy kept giggling whenever Hannah walked into the room. The next weekend, I took Hannah and the kids to the Renaissance Festival where it all began. We wandered through the booths, the kids running ahead to look at costumes and trinkets. As the sun started to set, we found ourselves in front of a small, quiet stage where a minstrel was playing soft music. I turned to Hannah, my heart pounding. "This is where it all started," I said. "You've been with me through so much, and I don't know what I'd do without you. I don't want to find out." Before she could respond, I dropped to one knee and pulled out the ring. "Hannah, will you marry me?" Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling up with tears. For a moment, she just stared at me, then at the kids, who were practically vibrating with excitement. "Yes," she finally whispered, then louder, "Yes." Emily and Tommy cheered, hugging us both. People around us clapped, and for a moment, the world felt perfect. That night, as we tucked the kids into bed, Hannah turned to me and said, "You didn't just change my life, Scott. You gave me a family. I'll never take that for granted." "Neither will I said, pulling her close. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The engagement set a new tone for our lives. It wasn't just about me and Hannah anymore. It was about building something permanent for the kids and for us. Emily started talking about the wedding nonstop, drawing pictures of dresses and asking if she could be the princess. Tommy was equally enthusiastic, demanding a night costume for the big day. Hannah and I hadn't set a date yet, but we didn't rush it. We both agreed that the focus was on continuing to build the life we'd started. Still, the engagement felt like a turning point, like all the uncertainty and chaos of the past few years was finally behind me. Julie, of course, didn't take the news well. When I told her about the engagement, during one of the kids' drop-offs, she froze. "You're really going through with this?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I am," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Hannah's good for me, and the kids, Julie. I hope you can see that." She didn't respond right away, just shook her head. "Just don't forget who their real mother is, Scott," she said coldly before walking away. Her words didn't sting like they used to. I was too focused on the future to let her pull me back into the past. The next few months flew by. My metalworking business grew steadily, and I started getting more custom orders, daggers, swords, even a few full suits of armor for serious collectors. Hannah was my biggest supporter, helping me organize orders and keeping the kids entertained while I worked late nights in the garage. One evening, I came inside after finishing a long project and found Hannah sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She smiled when she saw me. "You've got something special here, you know that?" I nodded, sitting across from her. "It's not just the work, though. It's you. The kids. Everything we've built together." Hannah reached across the table and took my hand. "We've built it together, Scott. That's what makes it special." As we started planning the wedding, it became clear how much Emily and Tommy wanted to be involved. Emily insisted on designing her own flower girl dress, complete with sparkly shoes and a tiny tiara. Tommy was just as enthusiastic about being a knight, and Hannah made it a priority to find a little suit of armor for him to wear. Seeing their excitement reminded me of why I'd fought so hard to rebuild my life after the divorce. This wasn't just about finding happiness for myself. It was about giving my kids a stable, loving family. One quiet evening, as I was tucking Tommy into bed, he looked up at me with his big, curious eyes. "Daddy," he said, "does this mean Miss Hannah is my mom now?" The question caught me off guard. I sat down on the edge of his bed and thought carefully about my answer. "Hannah loves you and Emily so much," I said, "and she's going to be a big part of our family. But your mommy is still your mommy, too." Tommy seemed satisfied with that answer, nodding sleepily before rolling over and hugging his stuffed dragon. That moment stuck with me. It wasn't about replacing Julie. It was about creating something new, something better. The day of the wedding crept closer, and as it did, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. The man who walked out of that house after Julie's betrayal felt like a stranger now. I wasn't that guy anymore, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. The day of the wedding was perfect in a way I never thought it could be. It wasn't flashy, just close friends, family, and a quiet ceremony at the same Renaissance festival that had reignited my life. The kids were more excited than anyone. Emily wore her flower girl dress with pride, spinning around to show off the sparkly shoes she'd picked out. Tommy marched around in his miniature suit of armor, a plastic sword clanging at his side. Hannah looked radiant. She wore a simple dress with a soft, flowing skirt and a small flower crown that Emily had helped make. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on mine, and I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. The ceremony was short but heartfelt. Emily handed us the rings, beaming with pride, while Tommy stood guard as our knight, making sure everything went smoothly. When Hannah said her vows, her voice shook with emotion. "You've given me more than love, Scott. You've given me a home, a family, and a reason to believe in second chances. I promise to love and support you through every challenge and every triumph." When it was my turn, I couldn't help but glance at the kids, sitting front and center. "Hannah, you've shown me what it means to rebuild, to trust, and to love again. I promise to be the best husband and the best father that I can be, for you, for Emily, and for Tommy." When the ceremony ended, the four of us walked hand in hand through the festival gates as a family. The reception was filled with laughter, music, and more love than I could have imagined. Mike gave a toast, raising his glass as he said, "Here's to new beginnings and finding joy in unexpected places." Even Julie made a brief appearance to drop off the kids. She stayed on the edges, quiet and watchful, but for once, there was no bitterness in her eyes. She gave me a small nod before leaving, and that was enough. Later that night, as the festival wound down and the kids dozed off in their chairs, Hannah and I sat together under the string lights. "We did it," she whispered, resting her head on my shoulder. "We did," I said, wrapping my arm around her. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I was finally home. Life after the wedding didn't change overnight, but it felt different, calmer, steadier, and full of hope. Emily and Tommy adjusted to the new routine easily, treating Hannah like she'd always been part of our family. Hearing them call her Mom Hannah more often made my heart swell every time. The business continued to grow. Orders from Renaissance enthusiasts and collectors kept coming in, and with Hannah's encouragement, I even started offering blacksmithing workshops on weekends. Teaching others how to forge felt just as rewarding as the work itself, and it gave me a way to share the passion that had rebuilt my life. But the biggest change came one quiet evening a few months after the wedding. Hannah and I were sitting on the porch, watching the kids chase fireflies in the yard. She reached for my hand, a soft smile playing on her lips. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice shaking slightly. I turned to her, concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said quickly. "In fact, I think it's pretty amazing." She hesitated, then placed my hand on her stomach. "We're having a baby, Scott." For a moment, I was speechless. The weight of her words sank in slowly, and when it did, I felt a rush of emotions: joy, disbelief, gratitude. I pulled her into my arms, laughing through the tears that sprang to my eyes. "A baby," I whispered, barely able to believe it. "We're really doing this?" She nodded, her own tears shining in the moonlight. We are. Emily and Tommy ran up, curious about why we were hugging so tight. We shared the news with them, and their excitement nearly knocked us over. Emily immediately started brainstorming names, while Tommy declared he was going to teach the baby everything about nights. In the months that followed, the house filled with a new kind of energy. Preparing for the baby brought us even closer, and every milestone, every kick, every doctor's appointment felt like a gift. When the day finally came, we welcomed a beautiful baby girl, Grace, into the world. Holding her for the first time, with Hannah by my side and the kids waiting eagerly to meet their sister, I felt like every broken piece of my life had finally come together. Looking back, I never imagined my journey would lead me here, from the betrayal that shattered my world to the family and life I never thought I'd have. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I thought I'd never move past the pain. But standing in that hospital room, surrounded by love, I realized that every step, every struggle, had brought me to this moment. Life isn't perfect, and it never will be, but it's mine, and for the first time in a long time, it feels whole. To anyone out there going through the storm, just know, there's hope on the other side. You just have to keep going. Thanks for reading, Reddit. Feel free to ask questions or share your own stories. Sometimes it helps just knowing you're not alone.